Thank you, Megan. Next time, say it a little louder.
I should have waited.
Well, welcome to everybody that's following along with us, whether they're following it live or picking this up later on. Again, we archive these for about 90 days. You'll also find that this week, Advent 3, if you get a chance, Pastor Call and I, we recorded it at Faith Germantown, and he did the Zephaniah text, and I did the gospel. So it would be a wonderful opportunity to be able to learn a little bit more about those texts if you decide to follow that. We have found some how wonderful it is. A lot of comments from people that follow our Bible classes by way of the online and have become quite faithful in following them. And I'm not talking people necessarily from Berea. There are some from our Agape Hill Church who do follow, and then others from outside of the church, which I give God thanks and praise for. Okay. Well, we got into chapter 9 last week, and so we are going to be picking it up right around the 11th verse here. And if you remember last week, we finished up chapter 8, Jesus, and as we talked about him being the high priest of the new covenant versus the high priests of the old covenant. Or what the Hebrew writer might use, instead of saying the old covenant, he might call it the high priest of the law. It's the same thing. It's what the old covenant, and we talked about that pretty extensively, that the old covenant was when God gave his law to his people. And the old covenant was, if you follow my, if you follow my law, I will. If you do what I command, you will. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And we know how well that has certainly gone. And now, as we talk about this new covenant, this better covenant, we spoke about Jesus being the high priest with this old covenant, new covenant theme, but he is talking about the old covenant, or the first covenant, and where that covenant kind of was played out in its worship life, which would have been, of course, in the temple, in the sacrificial, in its sacrificial way. And so it talks about, and he talked in there, verse 6, that priests would go in regularly, right, and they would perform their duties. They made sure the lampstands were lit. They made sure that the showbreads, or the breads of presence, were out. They would make sacrifice every day. There would be multiple sacrifices every day that would be made. And then in addition to that, what would happen is in addition to the regular sacrifices that would have been made, you would have also had all the sacrifices that the people brought. So, for various sin offerings or cleansings or thanks offerings or whatever the case may be. So, in addition to the regular sacrifices that would go out in the temple daily, there was also the ones that you as families would have been bringing at various times throughout your journey. And so, there was one text I read. They said, if you can imagine, if you can kind of picture the temple was kind of like a combination of a church, the way we recognize church, right? And a slaughterhouse and a marketplace. That would be what the temple, when you take a look at, when we talk about the temple, it was all of those things. And so imagine the amount of butchering that went on every day. Because again, there were sacrifices every single day. And there's significance to all of that. As we started to get into, and we're going to probably get into a little heavier today, is all of the significance of those sacrifices. And so it would talk about the high priest having to make sacrifice for himself and then for the people, and that it would have to happen every day. Why did it have to happen every day?
Because people sin every day.
Okay. There was a word that we've been kind of working our way with regarding the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant. What could the old covenant not do? What could it never do?
Could never save.
Could never offer perfection. Could never offer perfection. That's why they had to do it every day. Because it wasn't perfect. So it had to be done every day. No matter what they did, no matter how many animals they would sacrifice, it would never offer perfection. The animal sacrifices didn't offer forgiveness of sins. They pointed to those forgiveness of sins that would happen on that cross by the new high priest, the greater high priest, but they in themselves could not offer forgiveness of sins. Now, that's important because that says if they could offer forgiveness of sins, then what?
There was no need for it.
There was no need for Jesus to die. Yes. So they could never offer, it could never fulfill God's demand for perfection. Remember, that's his demand, is that we be perfect. And so that was important as we took a look at that. All right, verse 11. And somebody want to read 11 through 14.
But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls, and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, sanctified for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God.
Okay. All right, so now it says that, he says, but when, so now again, the word but, he's transitioning us from the old covenant way, the old covenantal ways of the Levitical priesthood into the new covenant. But when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things that have come, and this is really interesting. I never really thought of it this way until I did a little studying over the course of the last week. Now Jesus comes in, he comes on the scene, and he really comes on suddenly. Again, even though he had been promised for generation upon generation, and even though all the prophecies are fulfilled, but Jesus, when he's there, it's kind of like something that would catch many by surprise. And now he's there as the high priest, and what was something I thought that was interesting is he comes on as suddenly and as mysteriously as Melchizedek did. See, when we take a look at Melchizedek, when we were looking at Melchizedek in Genesis, you don't hear anything that kind of gets us up to who Melchizedek is and where he came from and all that. Remember, we were talking about that we don't have any register regarding him beforehand. So he just, all of a sudden, in Genesis, just appears on the scene. And that is kind of the same way that we see here with Jesus. He comes as but now he comes as the high priest of all the good things that have come. Through, it says, the greater and more perfect tent. Remember we talked about the tent of being the tabernacle, right? I think does yours say tabernacle? Yeah. NIV will use the word tabernacle, which is the same word for tent. God, when we say God tabernacles with his people, it means God tents with them, and so and this is a perfect tent, not a tent made with hands. What is the perfect tent? You remember from last week, the perfect tent. I think we brought it up. I don't know if you would remember. The perfect tent is heaven. When he talks about the perfect tent is heaven. Okay? So, and there is some significance to that as we're going to get through here in chapter 9. Is what the role heaven plays in the crucifixion. And so again, because this now you kind of have to just put a couple of things together. This is where 2 and 2 all kind of have to add up to the right things. Where did the old covenant sacrifices take place? In the temple, or before the temple, in the tabernacle, in the tent, right? Okay. So, where does the new covenant sacrifice take place? In the cross, right, which would be in Calvary, correct. However, the Hebrew writer is going to tell us that the new covenant sacrifice is made both in heaven, earth, and in heaven. So what we visualize on the cross is also happening in heaven. The punishment that is the actual sacrifice that is going on is happening in heaven, because that's where the Father is. And so it's really very interesting when he talks about him entering once for all into this greater and more perfect tent, is that the sacrifice is going to happen it actually happens while on the cross on Calvary, is happening in heaven. So it's one of the mysteries we can't grasp. But that's what the Hebrew writer is teaching us, is that is Jesus the high priest. That sacrifice is happening in the tabernacle, but it is the tabernacle of heaven. He enters once in the holy place, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. And I think that is really important, that we recognize that it is his blood that is the sacrifice, and that what makes that a better tent, or a better covenant, or the best covenant, is that this sacrifice of his blood is one that secures eternal redemption, which means that the other ones did not. Okay? So, the other thing here that I wanted to show you is that, let's see, for the blood of goats and blood of goats and bulls, and the sprinkling of the defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer. Now this here, this is really something that you would have to go back into Leviticus 16 for this. What would happen, one of the chief ceremonies of the first covenant would be this. There would be the actual sprinkling of the defiled persons with the blood. So as we would talk, we talk about the blood, as the blood is separated from the meat. It was done very carefully so that it would get all the blood. All right, so that it would separate they'd separate the meat from the blood. The meat would go onto the altar, and then the meat, a portion of it would get burned. Or I should say, a portion of it would get onto the altar. That would be burned to God, and it would be probably like a tithe, a tenth of it. Then the rest of the meat would be used for what? Right, to take care of, it was used to take care of the priests. And so that's what that would go on. And then, but the blood would get sprinkled upon the altar, because the meat without the blood was not sacrifice. See, no sacrifice can happen without blood. That's the key. No sacrifice could happen without the shedding of blood. And so there would be blood that would be sprinkled onto the altar, but then there would be blood also that would be sprinkled onto the priest. Why? Why do you think? Why would the priest have to be covered in blood?
Because he's just as simple as everybody else.
Correct. Because there is no sacrifice, there is no forgiveness, there's nothing without the shedding of blood. And even though that shedding of blood is pointing to the actual forgiveness that occurs on Calvary's cross, it was significant in that by faith it's still saved, because there were people who would have died before the cross. So what happens, right? So they would have been saved. But the blood had to be sprinkled upon them. And then the blood would be sprinkled upon the people. So the defiled persons, which would be sinners, they would have blood that was spread upon them. Numbers chapter 19, there was this ritual, was called the ritual of the red heifer. The ritual of the red heifer is a form of a cow, is a type of cow, right? Heifers. And so what would happen, a red heifer without blemish, and one that a yoke had never been put upon. So they would not have been one that would have been used for work or whatever the case may be. They would be slaughtered outside the camp. And then some of that blood would be sprinkled 7 times toward the front of the sanctuary. But all of the rest of the heifer would be burned, and not on the altar of the burnt offering, but it would be burned outside the camp. And it would be burned with cedar and with hyssop, cedar, which would provoke cedar. And the reason they used cedar was for durability. Hyssop, the hyssop was considered having cleansing power. And then a scarlet cloth, a blood red cloth. And that would all, you'll find that information in Leviticus 14, is that those items would be used in this. So this is something that would happen. And then what would happen from there is the residue, after that heifer was burned, was sacrificed, or actually there it was consumed or burned up. The ashes from that heifer then were saved. And they were preserved by the priest. And so whenever a person was defiled by contact with death, that would mean with a corpse or a grave. So, I I remember a number of years ago when I was a caregiver with my mom, and my mom passed away. So she had been dead, and you embrace her, you touch. If you just touch, you're considered defiled, and you would have to be cleansed of that. And so what would happen is now the ashes would be mixed with water. And the person would then be ritually sprinkled with a bunch of hyssop, because hyssop would be for cleansing. And it would remove the defilement, and it would qualify the person to stand again with the assembly of the people. What does that sound familiar? What today sounds familiar to that? Ash Wednesday is that's a great example. Baptism. Now in baptism, they don't mix ash with water, but it's the same way. It's the water. There, the water is providing cleansing, but here it's the water and then the ash. The ash being, a reminder. Wow, it's a reminder, one, of the fact that we are from dust we came, and to dust we shall return, but also that there would have been bloodshed to create that ash, right? You can't kill the cow without, you can't turn a cow to ash without shedding its blood. It's impossible. And so it would be, of course, as a reminder, a contrition. So yeah, Ash Wednesday is also a great example of that. So the water would be considered the purifier, right? But in this case, the water is the vehicle for the real cleansing agent, which would be the ash. And so that is really that's what he's talking about here when he talks about when he is talking about the ash of the heifer. So he's just kind of recalling one of these chief ceremonies of the original covenant, or the first covenant, I should say. So once the sanctuary now was established in Jerusalem, once they built the temple, right, the red heifer was burned on a specifically built altar on the Mount of Olives. And it was connected to the temple by a bridge across the Kidron River, which is really kind of interesting. What else was on the other side of the Kidron River? Do you remember from the temple? The Garden of Gethsemane was over there. So the heifers, they weren't burned weekly or even annually. The first would be burned. The first one burned in the days of Moses. The second one burned on Ezra. But from that time till the destruction of the temple, there were only they determined. I think it was Josephus that said there was only like 5 or 7 of them that were ever burned again after that. So it wasn't something that was a regular thing, but this is part of that old covenant. So the point being here is that, and we saw this earlier in the end of chapter 8, all of this was made obsolete. All of this is weak, and all of it was powerless for perfection, and that is the key to it. And so what it would do, especially this ritual of the ashes of the red heifer, what this would do, it would wash away the ceremonial impurities, right? The ritual defilements. Like I said, if you touched a dead person or something like that, it made you ceremonially unclean. Were you really unclean? No, it made you ceremonially unclean. So really, the only thing that the ashes of the red heifer could do would be to wash away those things, those ceremonial things. But So what he's saying is all of these only can operate at the level of the flesh, at the level of humanity. It can't wash away, it can't cleanse you spiritually. That's the key to it. It can only cleanse you at the earthly level, this. The best way for me to describe it is at the level of the flesh. That's the only cleansing it can offer. That was the old covenant, is that it could never cleanse you spiritually. They all have validity on earth, but none of them had validity in heaven. That's what he is saying. But now there is one who did. How much, and so if all of these things purified the flesh, verse 14, how much more would the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purifying our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So, what is that? What does it mean? As he talks about the conscience here, he is saying again, he's using this language to talk about the purification of the flesh and the purification of the conscience. He's using the word conscience to represent the spiritual person. Your conscience is your conscience something you can touch? No, but is it real? Yes. So it is a part of your spiritual makeup. So it would be in the same way as we would talk about the body and the soul. Okay, body and the soul, flesh and spirit. And the same thing, flesh and conscience. And so that is that's what he is speaking about here, is that it's through Christ, there's a purifying of our conscience. And that means it's a purifying of our spirit, which is an eternal redemption. So what does that mean? It says it makes you perfect. If you cleanse the spirit, you have cleansed you, because that is who you are. Your soul is who is that. That's who you are. And so Christ's blood cleanses that. So now we get to verse 15 here. And so in verse 15, we would go, let's see, somebody want to read 15 to 22.
Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins.
Okay, all right. So, now we hear as what we are seeing in this is the Hebrew writer is going to teaching us that the death of Jesus here is necessary for the ratification of the new covenant. That without Jesus' death, the new covenant doesn't happen. Okay? That's what he said. So, mediator of a new covenant. What is mediator?
Speaking on behalf of.
Okay, yeah, yes, either speaking on behalf or acting on behalf or whatever. Absolutely, he is on behalf of. That's exactly right. So now as we take a look here, he is kind of summing up chapter 7, 8, 9. In 7, he explains that perfection was not attainable under the Levitical priesthood, which is something that is going to pass away. It becomes obsolete, right? But that there's going to be a better covenant. Then he goes to chapter 8, and in chapter 8, Jesus attains to a ministry that is not earthly, it is not transient, but it's a heavenly ministry. And so the first covenant that God is basically saying we're throwing that one away, and we are I'm promising a new covenant, a better covenant. And so by doing that, he's saying that the first covenant is one we're getting rid of. And then chapter 9, he's going to combine all of this covenant and death, and he's going to argue that the death of Jesus now is indispensable, that the new covenant without the death of Jesus is not a new covenant. That the old covenant is going to kind of, in a dimly, look toward the new one, but it is really the new covenant that is the saving covenant. And so here we see in these words, he uses this word in verse 15, inheritance, eternal inheritance. I think in the NIV, does it say inheritance also? I think eternal inheritance. Okay. Inheritance is the same word as covenant. It's the same word as covenant. And both of those words mean last will and testament. All right? Covenant, inheritance, they both mean last will and testament. All right. So, what's the importance, or what happens in an inheritance? When does an inheritance distribute it?
After the death.
After a death. After a death. Without a death, the will or testament is what? It's a piece of paper. That's all it is. It is nothing more than a piece of paper. So it requires a death, and so as he talks about the old covenant, that tells you something. Now the old covenant, what required what? It required death. It required sacrifice. It's just that the death was animals, but it required the shedding of blood to be valid. Well, in the same way, the new covenant requires death. Not just a shedding of blood. Jesus couldn't just be hurt or injured or maimed or anything along those lines. He had to die. In the same, for the covenant to be ratified. That is really important for us to understand. It does not take effect unless there is a death. And so it teaches us here that Jesus' death is necessary. For where there's a will involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and that was, remember, the same things we talked about before as part of the purification, right? And he sprinkled it on the book itself. What was the book? The book was the laws. It was now the law of God. It was no longer on stone tablets. It was in a book. And he sprinkled it on both on the book and on the tent and on the vessels used in worship. So, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified. Almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Okay. So, that's another piece that is really significant here too, is that without the shedding of blood, there is not forgiveness of sins, because blood is what contains the life. Without blood, you die. There's a whole lot of things you could be without in your life. You can't be without your blood. Because nothing will function anymore without the blood. So that is really an important thing for us to understand. So, one of the things I wanted to show you here is note that as he is talking about the death of Jesus, and he is speaking of the death of Jesus and the shedding of Jesus' blood, and he's talking about the tent, in heaven, because it's the better tent versus the earthly tent of the tabernacle. There are a lot of times I got to go back a little bit. Often when we speak about Jesus, we speak about Jesus in connection with the Passover. He is the Passover lamb that is sacrificed. And we see that. And that's another image that points us to Jesus. Well, what's interesting here is the Passover is primarily a festival that is celebrated not by priests, but it is celebrated by the families. Passover was not something where we would gather at church for, okay? And I think that's maybe the best way of putting it, is that you didn't have to go to the temple or the tabernacle to celebrate Passover. Where did you celebrate Passover?
At home.
In your homes. Right, and so you celebrate in the homes, in the privacy of your home. Note here, as the Hebrew writer is teaching about the sacrifice of Jesus, he is not at any time in here does he connect Jesus' death to the Passover. Now we do, and it's correct to do that. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but from the standpoint of the argument that he is making, he put his thesis together at the beginning of Hebrews, and he's making the case for that because the Passover was something that was done in the home and not in the tabernacle or the temple. He doesn't talk about it. Why is that? It's because this entire discussion is about Jesus as the high priest. And the role of the high priest was a role of his work in the temple or in the tabernacle. It was not the role that he might have seen that would have been served in a family setting, right? It was his, the high priest they don't have their own homes. They lived on the ground. They lived basically in parsonages. So they didn't even have their own homes. And so here what we see is that our author is concentrating on the priestly activities that happen in the sanctuary, not the Passover. Now, again, as we talk about Jesus' blood, it certainly points us to the Passover. Or the Passover was a foreshadowing of the shedding of Jesus' blood. But the reason that he doesn't talk about it here is because the Passover would really have nothing to do with the role of high priest. I wanted you just to kind of see that because it is something that otherwise we might question, well, why isn't he talking about that to the Hebrew people? It's because that wouldn't have been something that would have been done at the sanctuary. Okay? So, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. All right. So, now we go to verse 23 and to the end of the chapter. Does somebody want to read that?
It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with a blood that is not his own. Then Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
Okay. So, interesting here, verse 23. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Something strange is going on here. Our author is saying that heavenly things, so the sanctuary and the furnishings and the vessels and the utensils of the sanctuary had to be purified. Does that mean that in some sense they were defiled? Or that they were in need of cleansing? See, this is really very interesting. He is speaking to us as though the heavenly sanctuary, remember we're talking now, this is the new tent, the better tent, which is, we were talking about, this is heaven. He is saying to us that even though the heavenly sanctuary was in existence, but it was not ready. That it was not ready for use until the better sacrifice of Christ. That the death of Jesus is what sets in motion the use of the sanctuary and the benefit that comes from it. So, in the same way that the bulls and the goats and all of the sacrifices, the blood of those sacrifices had to be thrown, had to be sprinkled on the altar and on the tabernacle, the tent, the sanctuary, in the Old Covenant, in that same way, the sanctuary, the altar, had to be sprinkled, of heaven, had to be sprinkled with what?
The blood of Christ.
The blood of Christ. So, again, as we were talking about the blood, the blood shed on Calvary, that blood shed on Calvary was sprinkled on the altar of heaven. We don't understand that. But this is what he's saying, is because that is what is now, and from there then comes the eternal redemption. Blood shed. That blood was shed and it was sprinkled on the altar, on the sanctuary. And we are now made perfect because that blood was shed in heaven. While we won't understand these things, this is what he is saying to us. So through that sacrifice of Jesus, through the blood shed, everything, all the barriers between us and God are now gone. So it's on our behalf that he tasted. Christ has entered not into the holy place made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to prepare copies of heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. You can see our creedal language in there. Now, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not of his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. So this, again, his blood was shed once for all. And that is something that we believe and teach and confess. Blood shed once, no re-sacrificing. We talked about that there are other church bodies that do that. They see Holy Communion as a re-sacrifice. It is not. Jesus' blood was shed once for all. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself once. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Sin has been dealt with. And so when Jesus comes, he will come. It's, that day of judgment, now we're going to go on a few minutes late. That day of judgment is going to come, and it's not like everybody's going to have to go through and be judged. That day of judgment, judgment is done. They have been judged already. And he will gather the elect, and he will take them to their heavenly home. The unbelievers will go into eternal damnation. But he says that, again, this is something that is going to happen on that last day. So he will come again. He's going to come again. But he's only died once. And he also, notice that it also says he dies once just as with man. Man only dies once. Okay? What does that wipe out?
Reincarnation.
Reincarnation. What else does that wipe out? When you think about it, maybe
What is it? Oh, what is it?
Well, yeah, you look at that, you're right, that which is a reincarnate. Hinduism, Buddha is similar. Ghosts, well, it wipes out the idea that the ghosts of individuals are, yeah, okay. Now, I'm not saying that there is no such thing as ghosts, because Jesus speaks of them. So, one of these, maybe we ought to talk about that. But what the thing is we don't see them coming. We don't see individuals coming back in that way. There is one death, and so really it does speak of. I think for us, the best is the idea of the reincarnation, that we are reborn into something else or something, that type of thing. Man dies one time, and so that is what he is. That's what he is saying here in this place. And so it doesn't need the repetition because man dies one time. I'm really late anyway, so I guess they're just going to have to wait for me. I want to show you one thing really quick before we go. Go to Psalm 118. Psalm 118. As we talk about the death, and man dying and dying once and must die. The 118. Psalm 118. And if you get into 19, it takes forever to get back to 18. All right. I'm going to go just to the back half of this. The Psalm 118 is a beautiful psalm. If we go to verse 16, I'll start at verse 16. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord exalts. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. Verse 17. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. When he talks about death, I shall not die, but I shall live. He is speaking here, of course, of the soul. That the soul will not die, the body will rest, the body will sleep, and the body will be reunited with the soul. But here, what he is saying, he's saying, open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter through it. What is the gate of the Lord? What do you think he is speaking about here? This is the gate of the Lord.
Christ.
Death. Death. This is the gate of the Lord, that I may enter through it. Death. So, as we talk about, not necessarily a yearning to die, right? We don't want to hurry things along. But there's also no fear, because this is what it is saying. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them. And this is the gate of righteousness. What is the gate of righteousness? It is that passing through from death to life. It's that one death that we die. That's the gate. The gate, that gate of righteousness is when, because of Christ's death and resurrection, death is not death. Death is the entrance through the gate of righteousness into heaven. It's just it's such beautiful words. I thank you that you have answered me. You've become my salvation, And then we see through we go through those gates is because of the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So it's through Christ. Claudia, you were right, but it is we enter it how? We enter it through death. Right now, everything is just as we talk about our eternal. We are an eternal being today. But we see it dimly. We don't see it in its fullness. When do we see it in its fullness? So, okay? All right. We'll get into chapter 10 next week, and I'm 10 minutes late, so I just have to drive twice as fast.
Uh-oh.